My name is Yash Gupta, and this is part 2 of implementing middleware for an application built using Azure functions. In the previous episode, we talked about serverless, middleware, and Azure functions. We also talked about different modes of execution for Azure functions and what benefits the isolated mode of execution provides over in-process mode of execution. Now let's jump over to Visual Studio to understand how to distinguish between different modes of execution. So if I create a new project here, search for Azure functions, next, give some name to the project, just leave it as it is. Now on the next screen, you see we have a drop-down called functions worker. This functions worker option is the key to segregating an Azure function application between in-process and out-of-process mode. Now, over here, if I select .NET 6, which is the most recent .NET version available, if I select this .NET 6 option and click on Create, this will create an Azure Functions application which will run on in-process execution mode. But if I select .NET 6 Isolated option over here and click on Create Now, this will create an Azure Function app which will be running in isolated mode of execution. And this is the key to separating these two types of Azure Functions projects. Now, let's talk about how to implement middleware using Azure Functions. So as we discussed, it's only possible with isolated mode functions as we have full control over the project startup configuration in this mode. In order to implement a middleware for your Azure application in .NET 6, we need to create a new middleware class that inherits from iFunctions worker middleware interface and implements this interface. And we can add our functionality in that custom middleware class. And once the functionality is in place, we can register the class during the host builder initialization in our program.cs file. Let's quickly switch over to Visual Studio and see how it works. This is a Azure Functions project running on isolated mode of execution. So as we can see here, we have a timer trigger function.cs class, which contains our Azure function. A method is called an Azure function if it contains this function attribute right at the top. Azure Functions Runtime use this attribute to identify any function which is an Azure function and trigger it during the execution of application. This one here is a timer trigger Azure function. And as you can see here, we have a cron expression determining the frequency of the execution of this function. This expression basically means that the timer trigger function will trigger at every 8th minute of every hour during the day. So this is our Azure function right here. Now let's go on to the middleware file. We have a file called exception handling middleware.cs. This is our custom middleware implementation. And as you can see, this class inherits from iFunctions worker middleware interface and implements it. In the invoke method here, there's a very simple logic in place. So whenever a request will come to the function app, this middleware will see if the execution is going normally as expected. And if that's the case, it will move on to the next middleware call. But in case something goes wrong here, this middleware will make sure to catch the exception and then log all the necessary exception details properly. Now, if we go to the program.cs file, you can see that we are initializing the host builder object. And over here, we are calling configure functions worker defaults method here. This method is mainly used to integrate middleware here and some other features as well. This function call here is the key to implement middleware for a function app because this method is not available to implement in the in-process mode of execution. There's a very strict coupling in that mode and we cannot do this over there. Now let's test it out. Let's say if an exception was to occur in our Azure function. Now let's trigger it every 5th minute so that we can run it quickly. As you can see, an exception has occurred. And if I click on continue, here goes our exception and the respective stack trace for that. So if you see here, we have got our dummy exception thrown, and we have a message: an exception occurred while calling the timer trigger function, with all the details. Now this log is directly coming from our middleware class, right? An exception occurred while calling the timer trigger function. So yeah, our middleware is working as expected. This concludes this discussion on implementing middleware for Azure functions. Thank you.